Hey guys, tonight let's do something very ambitious and very relaxing at the same time. Let's gently wander into ancient Rome. Not the movie version, not the shiny armor, heroic speeches, and perfectly sculpted abs version. No, we're going to the real Rome, the one that smelled strange, the one where daily life was uncomfortable, loud, occasionally impressive, and mostly kind of exhausting. So, dim the lights, put your phone down somewhere it can't emotionally hurt you, get comfortable. There is absolutely nothing in this story that requires urgency. No jump scares, no plot twists, just a long, slow walk through a civilization that everyone thinks they understand and almost nobody would actually want to live in. Ancient Rome liked to present itself as the greatest civilization on Earth, and to be fair, they were very good at infrastructure, conquest, and telling everyone else they were superior. They built roads that still exist, aqueducts that still function, bureaucracies so complicated they could ruin your life from hundreds of miles away, which is honestly impressive. But daily life for the average Roman was not a marble-filled epic. It was cramped, it was noisy, it was deeply unsanitary, and it involved a lot more waiting around than movies would like you to believe. Let's start with the city itself. Rome was enormous. Depending on the era, it may have had over 1 million people living inside it, which sounds impressive until you realize there were no modern sanitation systems, no trash pickup, no zoning laws, and no concept of personal space. Most Romans didn't live in elegant villas. They lived in apartment buildings called insulae. These were tall, narrow, cheaply built structures made to cram as many people as possible into as little space as possible. Think ancient slum high-rises, except with open flames, wooden staircases, and landlords who did not care if the building collapsed as long as the rent was paid on time. The higher up you lived, the poorer you were. Lower floors were more expensive because they had better access to water and were less likely to fall down. Upper floors were cheaper, more dangerous, and involved climbing several flights of stairs every single day. If you lived at the top, you were basically gambling with gravity. These buildings caught fire constantly. Rome burned so often that it became more of a recurring inconvenience than a shocking event. Firefighting existed, sort of, but it was slow and inconsistent. If your building caught fire, you grabbed what you could, accepted your fate, and hoped the flames didn't spread to your neighbor's place, which they probably would. And then there was the smell. Rome smelled bad. Not a little unpleasant bad, more like this city is actively trying to offend every human sense bad. There was no sewer system for most people. Human waste was often dumped into the streets. Public latrines existed, but they were shared, communal spaces with no privacy and no toilet paper. Instead, Romans used a sponge on a stick, a shared sponge, in water, used by everyone. Take a moment. Let that image gently drift by, and then drift away. Food scraps, dead animals, and general filth piled up in the streets. Animals wandered freely. Rats were everywhere. Insects were unavoidable. The soundscape alone would have been overwhelming. Vendors shouting, animals screaming, carts rattling, neighbors arguing through thin walls. Rome never slept, and it never shut up. Now, if you were wealthy, life was more comfortable, but not necessarily cleaner. Rich Romans lived in houses called domus, often centered around an open courtyard. These homes looked beautiful from the inside. Marble floors, painted walls, small gardens. But even wealthy Romans dealt with smoke-filled rooms, unreliable plumbing, and constant social obligations. Wealth didn't buy peace, it bought expectations. Roman society was obsessed with status. Everyone knew where they ranked. Senators at the top, then equestrians, then citizens, then freedmen, then slaves. And if you were a slave, you were considered property, not metaphorically, legally. Slavery was everywhere. It powered the Roman economy. Slaves cooked meals, cleaned homes, taught children, ran businesses, and worked in mines until they died. Some slaves lived relatively comfortable lives. Others were worked to death. Your experience depended entirely on who owned you and how replaceable you were. And slaves had no consistent legal protection. A master could punish, sell, or kill a slave with minimal consequence. It was normal, it was accepted, and it was never questioned by the people benefiting from it, which of course was most of Rome. Roman families were also complicated. The father, or pater familias, held absolute authority over the household. He controlled finances, he controlled marriages, he controlled punishments, and yes, he even had the legal right to kill family members in certain situations. This wasn't common, but the fact that it was legal tells you everything you need to know about Roman family dynamics. Love existed, affection existed, but so did fear, and obedience was not optional. Marriage was not about romance. It was about alliances, money, and producing legitimate heirs. Girls were often married in their early teens to much older men, not because Romans were uniquely cruel, but because they saw women primarily as vessels for children and household management. And childbirth was dangerous, extremely dangerous. Many women died young due to complications. Infant mortality was high. Losing children was tragically common. So common, in fact, that emotional distance became a survival mechanism. You couldn't grieve deeply every time. You simply couldn't afford to. Education depended on wealth. Rich boys were educated in rhetoric, philosophy, and public speaking, because Rome valued one skill above all others: persuasion. If you could speak well, you could rule, or at least survive the ruling class. Poor children worked early. They learned trades. They ran errands. They contributed however they could. Childhood, as a protected phase of life, didn't really exist. Entertainment, though, is where Rome really leaned into distraction. The famous phrase, bread and circuses, was not an exaggeration. The government understood that if people were fed and entertained, they were less likely to riot. Gladiator games were brutal, but they were also routine. Violence was normalized. Death was public. Crowds cheered. Fighters were admired and objectified. Some became celebrities. Others died anonymously in the sand. Executions were entertainment. Animal hunts were entertainment. Public humiliation was entertainment. Romans didn't separate morality from spectacle the way we do. If something was dramatic, it was fair game. Religion was deeply intertwined with daily life. Romans believed the gods controlled everything. Bad harvest? Angry gods. Illness? Angry gods. Political failure? Definitely angry gods. They performed rituals constantly. Sacrifices, omens, auguries. Priests interpreting bird flights and animal entrailments to decide major political decisions. Which sounds ridiculous until you realize people still make life choices based on far less evidence today. Romans were practical, but deeply superstitious. They feared curses. They wore amulets. They avoided unlucky days. And they took dreams very seriously. Bathing, surprisingly, was one of the nicer parts of Roman life. Public baths were everywhere. They were social centers. You went to bathe, but also to gossip, exercise, and relax. Everyone went, rich and poor. But again, no privacy. You bathed together, you sweated together, you scraped dirt off your skin with metal tools, and the water was not always as clean as you might hope. Still, compared to everything else, it was a luxury. Medical knowledge was experimental. Doctors existed, but their treatments were often questionable. Bloodletting, herbal remedies, magical thinking, surgery without anesthesia. Survival was not guaranteed. Life expectancy was low, but misleading. Many people died young, but if you made it past childhood, you had a decent chance of reaching middle age. Old age was respected, but also feared. There were no pensions, no retirement plans. You worked until you couldn't. And yet, Romans laughed. They told jokes. They wrote love poems. They complained about politics. They worried about money.
They loved their pets. They argued with neighbors. In many ways, they were deeply familiar. They just did all of it surrounded by smoke, noise, inequality, and a constant awareness that life was fragile and often unfair. So, when movies show Rome as a place of endless banquets and heroic speeches, remember this quieter truth. Rome was impressive, Rome was powerful, but Rome was also exhausting. And that's probably enough reality for now. Let's keep gently drifting through this world, where greatness and discomfort lived side by side, and where surviving the day was often more impressive than conquering anything at all. All right, let's keep floating. Nothing sharp, nothing alarming, just a slow, gentle walk into one of Rome's least comforting subjects, health, or what Rome...
Marriage existed alongside affairs, concubines, and prostitution. This was accepted. Wives were expected to be faithful. Husbands were expected to be discreet. Emotional intimacy was not the goal. Stability was. Women's lives varied widely depending on class. Wealthy women could manage households, influence politics indirectly, and control property. Poor women worked hard as vendors, laborers, servants. They had little protection and few choices. Despite restrictions, women found ways to assert themselves through family networks, through religion, through subtle influence. History often ignores this because it was quiet, but it was there. Children, again, were everywhere, running, working, learning, dying. Infant exposure was practiced. Unwanted babies could be abandoned. This was legal. It was tragic. It was normal. Survival shaped morality. Education emphasized memorization and discipline. Teachers used physical punishment. Learning was serious. Mistakes were corrected firmly. Creativity was secondary to obedience. And yet, art flourished. Poetry, sculpture, architecture. Romans appreciated beauty deeply. They just didn't believe beauty required kindness. As evening settled in, oil lamps were lit. Shadows filled rooms. People talked, ate simple meals, reflected on the day, or worried about tomorrow. Life slowed, briefly. Sleep came early, not because people were rested, but because darkness made activity difficult. Beds were simple. Comfort was relative. Dreams were interpreted. Nightmares were feared. And then morning came again, loud, unforgiving, familiar. Ancient Rome was not a single experience. It was millions of small, overlapping lives, some privileged, many struggling, all temporary. So when we imagine Rome as a place of grandeur and glory, remember this softer truth. It was also sore feet, bad smells, shared sponges, persistent noise, endurance. And somehow, through all of that, people lived, loved, complained, laughed, and went on. Let's keep drifting. Still no rush. Rome isn't going anywhere. It never really did. It just slowly rearranged itself while everyone inside tried to pay rent and avoid trouble. Work in ancient Rome was not about passion. No one was asking, what do you love to do? They were asking, what keeps you alive? Employment was practical, repetitive, and often exhausting. If you were born into a trade, congratulations, that was now your identity. Most Romans worked with their hands. Bakers, potters, metalworkers, weavers, dock workers, construction laborers. Cities were constantly being built, repaired, or rebuilt after fires. Physical labor was everywhere. It was respected in theory and looked down upon in practice. The elite praised hard work while avoiding it entirely. Slaves did much of the labor. Free workers competed with enslaved ones, which kept wages low. This created quiet resentment, but no solution.
The system was too profitable for the people in charge, and Rome was very good at not changing systems that benefited Rome. Money existed in coins, gold, silver, bronze. Inflation happened, debasement happened. Emperors quietly reduced precious metal content to fund wars and building projects. People noticed. Prices rose. Complaints followed. This cycle repeated often enough that it feels uncomfortably modern. There were banks, loans, interest. Debt was common, very common. Falling into debt could ruin your life. Defaulting could mean slavery, not metaphorical slavery, actual slavery. Financial stress was not abstract, it was personal and dangerous. Markets were loud, crowded, and chaotic. Haggling was expected. Cheating happened. Scales were adjusted when no one was looking. Laws existed, but enforcement depended on status. Justice was flexible. Money helped. If you were poor, every day involved calculation. How much bread could you afford? Could you pay rent? Would your building still be standing tomorrow? Stability was fragile. If you were wealthy, your stress was different. Maintaining status was expensive. Hosting dinners, funding public works, sponsoring games. Generosity was expected. Reputation required constant investment. Wealthy Romans often complained about being burdened by their own riches. This complaint was not widely sympathized with. Now let's gently step into leisure. Romans did have free time, sort of. Public holidays were frequent. Festivals honored gods, victories, and emperors. Work slowed. Drinking increased. Social boundaries loosened slightly. The theater was popular. Comedies mocked politicians. Tragedies explored fate and suffering. Audiences talked loudly, threw things, expressed opinions freely. This was not quiet, respectful theater. It was participatory. Sports were everywhere. Chariot racing was wildly popular. Fans supported teams passionately. Fights broke out. Riots happened. Entire neighborhoods aligned themselves with colors: green, blue, red, white. People cared deeply. Gambling was officially discouraged and unofficially everywhere. Dice games, betting, wagers on races and fights. Luck was admired. Skill was suspected. Losses were blamed on fate. Alcohol consumption deserves another calm mention. Wine was diluted but plentiful. Drinking was social. Intoxication was tolerated if not disruptive. Moralists complained endlessly. No one listened. Now let's talk about law. Roman law was sophisticated, written, structured, influential, but access depended on who you were. Courts favored the powerful. Oratory mattered more than evidence. If you could speak well, you could win. Punishments were public. Shame was part of justice. Exile was common for elites, death for others. Consistency was not a feature. Citizenship was valuable. It came with rights and protections. Non-citizens existed in a legal gray area. Over time, Rome expanded citizenship strategically. Loyalty was rewarded. Resistance was crushed. The army deserves a quiet pause. Soldiers were disciplined, organized, and essential. Military service offered social mobility. Veterans received land. Sometimes. Promises were not always kept. Soldiers endured harsh conditions, long campaigns, poor food, strict discipline, violence, trauma. There was no word for it. You simply returned home and continued. Religion followed soldiers too. They carried gods with them, built shrines, asked for protection, thanked gods for survival, blamed gods for failure. And then there were emperors, always present, always watching, even when absent. Imperial power varied wildly depending on who sat on the throne. Some were capable, some were unstable, some were terrifying. Ordinary people adapted. You learned which names to praise, which opinions to keep quiet. Survival often meant neutrality. Rumors spread quickly. News traveled through gossip, announcements, and inscriptions. Truth was flexible. Official narratives mattered more. As the empire grew, distances expanded. Rome ruled lands it barely understood. Cultures blended, languages mixed, local traditions persisted under Roman labels. This created diversity and tension. Rome tolerated differences until it didn't. Daily life continued under all of this. People woke up, worked, complained, loved, ached, hoped for small improvements. Rome did not promise happiness, it promised order, and sometimes not even that. So as we keep drifting through this vast, imperfect world, remember that Rome was not held together by glory, it was held together by routine, by people doing what they had to do day after day without applause. And that quiet persistence might be the most Roman thing of all. All right, let's keep floating slowly through the quieter, softer parts of Roman life. Not battles, not politics, not conquest, but the rhythms that filled daily existence, socializing, entertainment, and occasional chaos. Romans loved company. They loved it in a way that might feel exhausting to modern sensibilities. Public spaces were alive. Forums, baths, marketplaces, these were all buzzing, crowded, loud. Everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least had an opinion about it. Gossip was as essential as bread, possibly more. Let's talk about the baths again, because they were more than just hygiene. Baths were social hubs. People went to bathe.
Roman attitudes toward the afterlife were gentle but persistent. Ancestors were remembered. Tombs and grave markers lined roads outside the city. Funerary rites involved processions, offerings, and sometimes masks or effigies of the deceased. Memory mattered. Forgetting a deceased family member was seen as risky or disrespectful. Even in grief, life continued. Families observed rituals, mourned quietly or publicly, and resumed daily routines. The rhythm of life and ritual intertwined seamlessly, comforting, structured, and continuous. Festivals also offered social release. Drinking, dancing, music, and food created temporary relief from labor and hierarchy. People mingled across social classes, observed spectacle, and reinforced community. Humor, satire, and cleverness were often part of performances, allowing subtle critique of authority under the guise of celebration. Religion and festivals created continuity. Life could be unpredictable, noisy, and smelly, but rituals grounded it. They offered predictable markers in time. They provided small pleasures, gentle amusements, and a sense of participation in something larger than oneself. In short, these ceremonies and rhythms, public and private, helped Romans endure. They created order in chaos. They offered comfort in uncertainty. And they reminded citizens that life, even in its daily discomforts, had meaning and structure. As we float further, let's quietly notice how these rituals, repeated for generations, formed the gentle backbone of Roman society. Through festivals, prayers, and daily routines, Romans endured, persisted, and quietly shaped an empire that seemed grand, intimidating, and permanent, but was ultimately held together by the smallest, most persistent human actions. We'll continue slowly, gently, exploring more of the textures, habits, and quiet endurance that defined life in ancient Rome. All right, let's drift onward, slowly navigating the roads, alleys, and pathways of Rome. Not dramatic battles or heroic marches, just the quiet, constant motion of daily life that carried millions of people through the city and across the empire. Travel in Rome was complicated. The wealthy moved with relative ease in carriages or litters, while most citizens walked.
Roads were crowded, noisy, and often uneven. Roman engineers built impressive roads connecting the city to distant towns, but within the city itself, streets were narrow, chaotic, and sometimes fragrant in ways that modern noses might find challenging. Public transportation, as we might imagine it today, didn't exist. Instead, people relied on walking, hiring a litter, or taking a private carriage if they could afford one. Delivery carts operated mostly at night to avoid daytime congestion. This meant that the streets were alive at odd hours, full of animals, carts, and early risers moving quietly or not so quietly through the city. Traffic was noisy. Horns, carts, animals, and pedestrians combined into a constant urban hum. Vendors shouted their wares. Merchants displayed goods outside their shops. Children ran between legs. Dogs barked. Romans adapted or learned to ignore it. Noise in Rome was a constant companion. City planning had practical goals. Aqueducts delivered water. Public fountains offered drinking water. Latrines, baths, and markets were placed strategically. Yet chaos persisted. Fires spread quickly. Streets clogged. Accidents happened. Rome's beauty was intertwined with its disorder. Travel outside the city to villas, farms, or other towns was slower. Roads could be rough. Weather was unpredictable. Inns existed, but accommodations were variable. Travelers relied on preparation, luck, and local guidance. Even short journeys involved planning, patience, and endurance. Sea travel was more challenging. Ships connected ports across the Mediterranean. Storms, piracy, and delays were constant risks. Merchants and travelers accepted these risks as part of life. Successful journeys brought goods, news, and social advantage, but never guaranteed comfort. For ordinary Romans, movement wasn't glamorous. Markets, baths, temples, and social gatherings required walking through crowded, noisy streets. Every trip was a sensory experience: smells, sounds, textures, and constant interaction with other people. Patience was required. Observation was essential. Quick decisions avoided collisions, arguments, or minor injuries. Street life also meant encountering social variety. Citizens, foreigners, slaves, soldiers, merchants, and beggars mingled constantly. Differences in appearance, language, and behavior created subtle social tension, observation, and adaptation. People learned to read cues, interpret gestures, and maintain hierarchy in every interaction. Commerce relied heavily on this movement. Merchants traveled to sell goods. Markets required daily attention. Supply chains extended across the empire, connecting Rome to distant provinces. Every product, from grain to pottery, wine to spices, traveled along roads, rivers, or seas, arriving eventually in crowded city markets for consumption. Mail and information moved similarly, slowly but methodically. Letters traveled by courier or merchant. News spread by word of mouth, announcements, and inscriptions. Accuracy was often uncertain. Speed was relative. People adapted by anticipating delays and preparing for misunderstandings. Animals were everywhere, both helpers and obstacles. Horses, oxen, donkeys, and dogs moved goods and people. Chickens, pigs, and goats were raised in small spaces. Animals required care and caused accidents, but they were indispensable to life and commerce. Through all of this, life persisted. People traveled to work, to socialize, to worship, or to participate in civic duties. Streets were noisy, chaotic, and essential. Survival, convenience, and comfort were constantly negotiated. And yet, despite the disorder, Romans moved with a rhythm. They learned patterns, anticipated behaviors, and quietly endured the unpredictability of urban life. Noise, smell, and chaos became familiar companions. Life was never serene, but it was constant. So as we continue floating, gently observing, let's notice how Rome's streets, roads, and travel habits created the living framework of the city. People endured the hustle, negotiated its challenges, and persisted. And through these countless small movements, the city itself came alive, day after day, century after century. We'll continue, slowly, exploring more aspects of Roman life, the quieter, subtler routines, habits, and endurance that truly shaped the empire. All right, let's drift gently into the quieter world of Roman learning. Not grand philosophical debates or dramatic breakthroughs, but the steady, disciplined cultivation of knowledge that shaped citizens, leaders, and the rhythm of daily life. Nothing sudden, nothing intense, just a calm look at how Romans learned, thought, and passed wisdom along. Education was a privilege for some, a duty for others, and largely inaccessible to many. Wealthy families invested in tutors or sent their children to schools, while poor children learned trades, memorized basic skills, or absorbed knowledge informally from family and community. Schooling reflected social status. It was as much about appearance and preparation for public life as it was about actual learning. Boys studied rhetoric, grammar, literature, and philosophy. Memorization was key. Recitation mattered more than interpretation. They learned to speak, argue, and present ideas convincingly. Debate and eloquence were social currency. Success in public life often depended more on skillful speech than moral merit or expertise. Girls in wealthy households sometimes received education focusing on literacy, household management, and social skills. In some cases, they studied literature or philosophy. Their education was designed to strengthen family influence, manage households, and prepare for advantageous marriages. Creative or independent thinking was less emphasized than obedience, decorum, and competence. Schools were small, sometimes crowded, and often strict. Discipline was enforced with physical punishment and verbal correction. Teachers expected attention, memorization, and conformity. Mistakes were noted. Repetition reinforced learning. Mastery of detail mattered. Stressful? Perhaps. Effective? Sometimes. Gentle?
The elderly experienced gradual decline. Retirement was informal. Dependence on family or household networks increased. Social value shifted from labor to wisdom, storytelling, and advisory roles. Life's rhythm slowed, but persistence continued. Daily routines, rituals, and small tasks maintained continuity. Death was inevitable and omnipresent. Romans coped with it through ritual, memorial, and community. Funerals were social events. Tombs and grave markers were maintained. Memory, continuity, and honor mattered more than dramatic displays of grief. Life went on quietly for those left behind. Through all of this, survival depended on consistency, observation, and adaptation. Romans endured discomfort, disease, and mortality with gentle resilience. Health was rarely perfect, but routines, remedies, and persistent care allowed life to continue. So, as we drift further into the subtle, everyday persistence of Roman life, let's quietly notice how citizens navigated illness, cared for one another, and endured the slow, steady challenges of survival. These rhythms, repetitive, modest, and enduring, were as essential to Rome as laws, roads, or monuments. We'll continue slowly, exploring more routines, quirks, and understated endurance that defined life in the eternal city. All right, let's drift gently into another layer of Roman life: homes, neighborhoods, and the subtle rhythms that shaped daily living. Nothing dramatic,
Nothing heroic, just the persistent, gentle patterns of how Romans lived, slept, and interacted within the physical spaces of their city. Housing varied widely by wealth and status. The elite lived in domus, spacious, multi-roomed homes centered around an open courtyard called an atrium. These homes had private rooms, decorated walls, mosaic floors, and gardens. Space was used deliberately, reflecting both function and status. Even in comfort, daily life was structured, slow, and methodical. Poorer citizens lived in insulae, multi-storied apartment blocks. Space was tight, privacy was minimal, fire and structural collapse were persistent risks. Noise, odors, and crowding were constants. Life in these buildings required patience, adaptation, and tolerance for chaos. Residents learned to navigate narrow stairways, shared water sources, and limited sanitation quietly, day by day. Urban neighborhoods were bustling ecosystems. Streets teemed with vendors, pedestrians, animals, and carts. Noise, smell, and activity were persistent companions. Residents adapted, learned routines, and developed subtle social awareness, knowing which paths were safer, which vendors were reliable, and how to negotiate space with neighbors politely but firmly. Interior life was structured around function. Kitchens were often small but efficient. Hearths were central to cooking and heating. Storage was carefully organized. Rooms had multiple purposes: dining, sleeping, socializing. Quiet adaptation was necessary, especially in cramped apartments or multi-generational households. Gardens and courtyards offered respite. Even small spaces provided light, air, and opportunity for reflection. Plants, fountains, and shaded areas allowed citizens to escape street noise temporarily. Observing nature, maintaining plants, or sitting quietly in a courtyard offered minor comfort in a bustling, noisy city. Neighborhoods had subtle social rules. Residents observed hierarchy, reputation, and custom in interactions with neighbors. Complaints, favors, and informal agreements structured relationships. Quiet negotiation maintained social harmony and continuity. Minor irritations, noise, smells, or encroachment were managed through patient observation and social cues. Construction quality mattered. Elite homes used stone, marble, and concrete. Apartments were brick, wood, and plaster. Maintenance was constant. Repairs, cleaning, and minor renovations ensured safety and comfort. Even routine tasks required observation, planning, and persistence. Life demanded slow, deliberate attention to surroundings. Sanitation was limited but structured. Public latrines, fountains, and sewers provided basic services. Cleanliness was ideal but imperfect. Citizens adapted through daily habits, sweeping streets, washing in basins, and observing hygiene norms where possible. Adaptation, persistence, and patience were essential for daily comfort. Light and ventilation shaped interiors. Windows were small, often barred and covered with cloth or translucent materials. Interiors were dim, quiet, and insulated from street chaos, though not entirely. Lighting relied on oil lamps and candles. Residents moved slowly, performed tasks deliberately, and learned to navigate spaces with awareness and care. Life in neighborhoods reflected collective rhythm. Children played quietly in courtyards or streets. Merchants moved goods. Neighbors conversed, argued, and observed. Social cohesion was subtle but essential. Community persisted not through dramatic loyalty, but through repetitive, patient interaction. Even death affected neighborhoods. Funerals passed through streets. Tombs and memorials were visible at city edges.
Residents adapted to reminders of mortality, integrating them into their daily awareness. Continuity, memory, and persistence shaped social and physical landscapes alike. So, as we continue drifting through Rome, let's notice how housing and neighborhoods created the stage for enduring life. The city thrived not through grandeur alone, but through the slow, quiet persistence of inhabitants adapting, observing, and navigating their spaces day after day. We'll continue gently exploring more aspects of domestic life, daily habits, and the subtle endurance that defined the ordinary rhythms of Rome. All right, let's drift gently into another layer of Roman life: homes, neighborhoods, and the subtle rhythms that shaped daily living. Nothing dramatic, nothing heroic, just the persistent, gentle patterns of how Romans lived, slept, and interacted within the physical spaces of their city. Housing varied widely by wealth and status. The elite lived in domus, spacious, multi-roomed homes centered around an open courtyard called an atrium. These homes had private rooms, decorated walls, mosaic floors, and gardens. Space was used deliberately, reflecting both function and status. Even in comfort, daily life was structured, slow, and methodical. Poorer citizens lived in insulae, multi-storied apartment blocks. Space was tight, privacy was minimal. Fire and structural collapse were persistent risks. Noise, odors, and crowding were constants. Life in these buildings required patience, adaptation, and tolerance for chaos. Residents learned to navigate narrow stairways, shared water sources, and limited sanitation quietly, day by day. Urban neighborhoods were bustling ecosystems. Streets teemed with vendors, pedestrians, animals, and carts. Noise, smell, and activity were persistent companions. Residents adapted, learned routines, and developed subtle social awareness, knowing which paths were safer, which vendors were reliable, and how to negotiate space with neighbors politely but firmly. Interior life was structured around function. Kitchens were often small but efficient. Hearths were central to cooking and heating. Storage was carefully organized. Rooms had multiple purposes: dining, sleeping, socializing. Quiet adaptation was necessary, especially in cramped apartments or multi-generational households. Gardens and courtyards offered respite. Even small spaces provided light, air, and opportunity for reflection. Plants, fountains, and shaded areas allowed citizens to escape street noise temporarily. Observing nature, maintaining plants, or sitting quietly in a courtyard offered minor comfort in a bustling, noisy city. Neighborhoods had subtle social rules. Residents observed hierarchy, reputation, and custom in interactions with neighbors. Complaints, favors, and informal agreements structured relationships. Quiet negotiation maintained social harmony and continuity. Minor irritations, noise, smells, or encroachment were managed through patient observation and
Work in Rome depended heavily on social class. The wealthy managed estates, oversaw finances, or pursued political careers. Their labor was largely administrative or ceremonial. Slaves and servants performed most physical work. For the poor, work was hands-on. Craftsmen, merchants, bakers, farmers, and laborers ensured the city functioned. Daily toil defined survival. Craftsmen practiced repetitive tasks with precision. Potters shaped clay, blacksmiths hammered iron, weavers spun thread. Skills were passed through apprenticeship, observed quietly, and perfected slowly over years. Work required patience, endurance, and focus. Mistakes were corrected methodically. Mastery was incremental, not dramatic. Agriculture remained fundamental.
Farmers planted, watered, and harvested crops according to seasons. They relied on knowledge of soil, weather, and crops, adapting gradually to environmental challenges. Life depended on the quiet rhythms of planting and harvesting. Every season required preparation, attention, and persistence. Merchants engaged in trade, negotiation, and logistics. Markets were busy, noisy, and chaotic, but trade followed predictable routines. Buying, selling, moving goods, and maintaining relationships created structure. Patience, observation, and social awareness were essential. Commerce was slow, persistent, and necessary for survival. Labor was rarely glamorous. Bricklaying, construction, and road repair required endurance. Workers dealt with noise, dust, and physical strain daily. Rewards were modest but consistent. Routine provided a rhythm, and repetition taught efficiency and skill. Life's persistence was embedded in every task. Slavery formed a constant background to labor. Slaves worked in households, farms, workshops, and markets. Treatment varied widely. Some endured harsh discipline, others found stability, trust, or small autonomy. Their labor sustained households and the broader city, quietly maintaining the engine of Rome. Even administrative work had a rhythm. Record-keeping, tax collection, and law enforcement required observation, attention, and patience. Errors could create problems, but systems were designed for incremental correction, slow adjustment, and persistent management. Efficiency emerged over repetition and continuity, not excitement. Work also structured time. Citizens rose early, attended to tasks, and adapted to predictable routines. Meals, rest, worship, and leisure were scheduled around labor. Life's flow was steady, structured, and rhythmic. Chaos existed, but daily routine provided balance. Economic cycles influenced daily life subtly. Supply and demand, seasonal harvests, and political edicts caused minor fluctuations, but adaptation and patience maintained continuity. People endured scarcity, congestion, and occasional misfortune with calm persistence. Even in leisure, work persisted indirectly. Craftsmen practiced skills, students learned practical knowledge, and merchants maintained networks. Life blurred labor and routine, creating a continuous rhythm of small effort, observation, and gradual mastery. So, as we continue drifting through Rome, let's notice how labor, ordinary, repetitive, and persistent, sustained both the city and its inhabitants. Life advanced slowly, patiently, and continuously through work, adaptation, and enduring effort. Next, we'll gently explore the subtler habits, domestic routines, and enduring social practices that quietly shaped Roman society day after day. All right, let's drift further into the quieter, enduring rhythms of Roman existence, family life, and domestic routine. Nothing dramatic, no sudden upheaval, just the slow, persistent flow of people living, interacting, and quietly sustaining one another within households. Family structure in Rome was hierarchical. The paterfamilias, the male head of the household, held authority over property, finances, and family decisions. His word carried weight, but day-to-day life involved negotiation, observation, and subtle influence among family members. Authority was persistent, tempered by practicality, and reinforced through routine. Children were educated at home or in small schools. Boys learned skills, social etiquette, and literacy. Girls learned household management, literacy, if permitted, and social navigation. Education was repetitive, disciplined, and structured around expectation. Play existed, but always alongside observation and learning. Childhood was a slow apprenticeship in survival and social awareness. Meals were central to domestic life. Families ate together when possible. Bread, legumes, vegetables, and occasional meat provided sustenance. Mealtime reinforced hierarchy, habit, and subtle communication. Observing table manners, sharing portions, and respecting seating order created continuity in domestic routine. Conversation was calm, instructive, and often repetitive, gentle reinforcement of social and moral norms. Daily chores structured household rhythm. Cleaning, cooking, laundry, and maintenance occupied much of the day. Tasks were repetitive, necessary, and quietly demanding. Even the wealthiest households required oversight, adaptation, and patience. Work and routine intertwined seamlessly. Slaves formed an integral part of domestic life. They cooked, cleaned, cared for children, and managed logistics. Their labor, while unglamorous, sustained the household. Relationships between family members and slaves were structured, hierarchical, and persistent. Mutual dependence created subtle bonds of endurance, observation, and compliance. Marriage was both practical and social. Arranged unions reinforced alliances, status, and stability. Love might exist quietly, subtly, but expectation dictated decisions. Marital life involved negotiation, patience, and adaptation. Household harmony depended on observation, tact, and endurance over time. Elders were respected. Grandparents and older family members contributed advice, supervision, and continuity. They embodied memory, experience, and social precedent. Life's rhythm slowed with age, but persistence and observation remained central. Households operated on long-term continuity, integrating experience, ritual, and routine. Entertainment within homes was calm and structured. Music, storytelling, and reading created gentle engagement. Small games, quiet conversation, and occasional minor indulgences punctuated daily life. Leisure was embedded within routine, never chaotic, and always socially instructive. Religious observance continued within the household. Shrines, offerings, and prayers marked daily patterns. Family rituals reinforced endurance, social cohesion, and subtle continuity. Even small, repetitive acts carried meaning and comfort. Conflict existed quietly. Arguments, disagreements, and subtle rivalries were resolved through negotiation, authority, or ritualized practice. Life required observation, patience, and sometimes gentle compromise. Harmony was slow, deliberate, and maintained through small, persistent actions. So, as we drift further, gently observing Roman domestic life, we notice how families, routines, and subtle interactions created a resilient, enduring social structure. Life was slow, repetitive, and continuous, but these quiet rhythms were the backbone of the city's stability. Next, we'll continue floating through the quieter aspects of leisure, personal reflection, and the enduring endurance that defined Roman daily existence. All right, let's continue drifting gently into the subtler, often overlooked layers of Roman life. Social interaction within neighborhoods. Nothing dramatic, no sudden revelations, just the slow, continuous web of observation, conversation, and subtle negotiation that shaped daily existence.
Stoicism, in particular, emphasized endurance, self-control, and acceptance of life's unpredictable nature. Individuals practiced observing what could and could not be controlled. Minor frustrations, noise, traffic, gossip became exercises in tolerance. Personal reflection was slow, methodical, and quiet, cultivating resilience over time. Epicurean thought offered a slightly different rhythm, seeking modest pleasure, reducing anxiety, and valuing friendship. Even small meals, social interactions, or leisurely walks were understood as important tools for mental well-being. Happiness was subtle, repetitive, and habitual, rather than intense or dramatic.
Journaling and correspondence were common among the literate. Citizens recorded observations, reflected on decisions, or advised family and friends. Letters were long, carefully composed, and circulated slowly. Reading and writing reinforced calm observation, careful thought, and the patient navigation of life. Religion intertwined with inner reflection. Daily prayers, offerings, and household rituals offered gentle prompts for contemplation. Observing omens, interpreting dreams, and maintaining minor rituals created a framework for reflection on cause, consequence, and personal conduct. Life's unpredictability was managed through small, consistent acts. Leisure complemented reflection. Gentle walks, simple games, music, or quiet conversation provided opportunities to think, observe, and digest experience. Engagement was slow, rhythmical, and repetitive, reinforcing patience, endurance, and subtle self-awareness. Even social observation was reflective. Watching street activity, children playing, vendors negotiating, or neighbors interacting offered insights into human behavior, hierarchy, and social rhythm. Romans integrated observation into life itself, making reflection both public and private, quiet and continuous. Adversity prompted slow, deliberate contemplation. Minor misfortune, illness, scarcity, or conflict was endured through habitual reflection, modest preparation, and subtle adaptation. Life demanded patience. Insight grew gradually. Endurance was cultivated quietly, day by day. Through all of this, the inner life of Romans was gentle, persistent, and structured. Reflection, philosophy, and quiet observation provided stability, continuity, and mental resilience. Life's small challenges were met not with drama, but with repetition, endurance, and subtle preparation. So, as we float further, gently observing, let's notice how personal reflection, quiet, slow, and continuous, helped citizens endure daily life, maintain composure, and navigate the persistent rhythms of ancient Rome. Next, we'll continue exploring the quieter, understated routines of health, diet, and domestic habits that quietly sustained Roman existence. All right, let's drift gently into one of the most persistent and quietly structuring aspects of Roman life: food, diet, and the rhythms of daily meals. Nothing flashy, no sudden feasts or dramatic banquets, just the slow, deliberate patterns of nourishment that shaped survival, habit, and social interaction. Romans ate 3 main meals a day, though the structure depended on class and occupation. Breakfast was light: bread, fruit, and perhaps cheese. Lunch was modest for the working population, often leftovers or simple grains. Dinner, the main meal, could range from basic to elaborate, depending on wealth and occasion. The rhythm of eating was repetitive, predictable, and quietly instructive. Food was practical. Wheat, barley, legumes, vegetables, and occasional meat formed the staples. Wealth allowed wine, olives, fish, and imported delicacies. Meals reflected both availability and status. Even small variations signaled hierarchy. Quality, quantity, and presentation communicated subtle social meaning. Preparation involved routine. Kitchens, whether in domus or insulae, were spaces of constant activity. Cooking over hearths required patience, attention, and care. Ingredients were prepared methodically. Spices were used sparingly, primarily to preserve or enhance flavor. Every meal was a small exercise in endurance, attention, and adaptation. Dining was social. Families gathered when possible. Conversations were quiet, structured, and focused on observation, advice, or minor commentary. Table manners mattered. Seating arrangements reinforced hierarchy. Meals were a subtle tool of education, socialization, and continuity. Street food and markets added variety. Vendors sold bread, cheese, fried fish, and simple snacks. For the working population, these meals were convenient, repetitive, and integrated into the rhythm of work and leisure. Even quick bites contributed to the flow of daily life, connecting nourishment with observation, social awareness, and adaptation. Luxury and indulgence existed, but subtly. Banquets featured multiple courses, sometimes exotic ingredients and elaborate presentation. Conversation, ritual, and etiquette guided the experience. The pleasure of eating was never chaotic. It followed repetition, expectation, and hierarchy. Preservation shaped diet. Salting, drying, and pickling extended shelf life. Romans relied on predictable methods to store and prepare food, reducing uncertainty. Knowledge of seasonality, storage, and preparation was quietly cumulative, passed from household to household, generation to generation. Children learned food habits slowly. Repetition, modeling, and mild instruction guided eating behavior. Even in mundane consumption, subtle endurance and observation were cultivated. Diet also influenced health. Consistent, modest nutrition allowed survival and endurance, though disease and malnutrition were persistent risks for the poor. Meals reinforced continuity, a small, predictable anchor in the daily rhythm of life. Through all of this, the act of eating in Rome was not merely survival. It was a slow, continuous ritual of care, observation, and subtle social instruction. Repetition, patience, and modest indulgence shaped both body and social awareness. So, as we float through the quiet, steady world of Roman nourishment, let's notice how these daily rituals, repetitive, structured, and understated, sustained life, reinforced social bonds, and anchored the persistent rhythms of the city. Next, we'll gently explore the understated rituals of religious practice, public festivals, and civic participation that punctuated daily life in ancient Rome. All right, let's drift gently into another persistent and quietly structuring layer of Roman life: religion, festivals, and the understated rituals that punctuated daily existence. Nothing shocking, no divine intervention, just the slow, methodical observance of custom, expectation, and quiet communal participation. Religion in Rome was woven into every aspect of life. Household gods, public temples, and civic rituals structured daily routines. Devotion was less about fervent emotion and more about consistency, observation, and acknowledgement of forces beyond personal control. People performed acts of reverence slowly, deliberately, and habitually. Households maintained small shrines called latraria, where offerings of food, wine, or incense were made. These rituals occurred quietly, often multiple times a day, guiding awareness and attention. They reinforced continuity, family cohesion, and subtle moral instruction. Even in repetition, meaning persisted. Public festivals and civic ceremonies provided rhythm to communal life. Calendar dates were marked with games, sacrifices, and processions. Participation was expected, reinforcing social cohesion and hierarchical awareness. Attendance was slow, measured, and orderly, emphasizing endurance and observation rather than excitement or drama. Priests and officials maintained temples and rituals with persistent attention to detail. Preparations involved repeated repetition, cleaning altars, arranging offerings, reciting prayers, and following precise.
Next, we'll gently explore trade networks, long-distance commerce, and the slow, connective pulse that linked Rome to the wider world. All right, let's drift gently further, beyond the city streets, into the persistent, subtle rhythms of trade and commerce that connected Rome to the wider Mediterranean and eventually much of the known world. Nothing dramatic, no sudden discoveries, just the quiet, continuous movement of goods, people, and ideas across time and space. Rome was both hub and consumer. Grain from Egypt, wine from Gaul, olive oil from Hispania, and spices from the East moved along predictable routes. Merchants, middlemen, and sailors sustained this slow, continuous flow. Delays, weather, and piracy were constants, yet systems endured. Endurance, observation, and patience were essential for every participant. Sea trade relied on predictable rhythms. Ships left harbors according to season, wind, and tide. Navigation was cautious, methodical, and repetitive. Merchants calculated risk, prepared cargo carefully, and monitored routes slowly. Even setbacks were handled with quiet adaptation rather than panic. Life was procedural, rhythmic, and cumulative. Land routes followed the network of Roman roads. Carts, pack animals, and riders moved goods at a deliberate pace. Inns, way stations, and small towns created a slow, steady infrastructure. Travelers adapted to terrain, weather, and bureaucracy. Observation and endurance ensured survival and consistent delivery. Merchants managed accounts meticulously. Inventory, prices, and contracts were recorded, reviewed, and adjusted slowly. Relationships with suppliers and clients required repeated interaction, careful observation, and subtle negotiation. Trust was built over time, not through excitement or drama. Continuity was key. Luxury trade existed alongside everyday necessities. Exotic animals, silks, perfumes, and rare spices were transported with care, often slowly and over long distances. Display and presentation mattered. Patrons observed, evaluated, and decided cautiously. Consumption was deliberate, structured, and socially codified. Communication across networks was gradual. Letters, messengers, and verbal reports transmitted news of supply, demand, and opportunity. Updates were slow but reliable. Merchants and officials learned to anticipate delays, observe patterns, and adapt accordingly. Patience and observation were essential. Even small towns and villages participated in trade networks. Local markets connected to regional hubs. Farmers, artisans, and merchants contributed incrementally to broader systems. Life in these communities moved slowly, rhythmically, and predictably. Adaptation to season, social expectation, and routine shaped daily activity. Trade influenced social hierarchy subtly. Wealth, access to rare goods, and control of logistics conferred status. Observation, strategic patience, and careful participation reinforced social order. The system persisted quietly through cumulative effort, repetition, and endurance. Through all of this, Rome's reach extended not through sudden conquest alone, but through persistent, continuous trade, slow observation, and quiet adaptation. Life depended on predictable rhythm, patient planning, and cumulative effort across time and space. So as we drift gently through the networks of commerce, let's notice how the slow, persistent flow of goods and information quietly shaped both the city and the wider world. Trade was not chaotic. It was a steady, enduring pulse connecting millions of lives in subtle, continuous rhythm.
Next, we'll continue floating into the daily rhythms of entertainment, public spectacle, and subtle amusement that balanced the slow persistence of Roman life. All right, let's drift gently back into the city itself, exploring the quieter side of Roman entertainment and public spectacle. Nothing dramatic, no sudden thrills, just the slow, continuous rhythm of amusement, observation, and social participation that quietly structured daily life. Entertainment took many forms, from small domestic amusements to massive public spectacles. Music, games, and theater existed alongside the grand arenas of chariot races and gladiatorial shows. The rhythm was persistent. Citizens learned when events occurred, how to behave, and how to participate slowly and patiently. Theaters offered long, measured performances. Comedy relied on subtle exaggeration, social observation, and repetition of familiar themes. Tragedy explored fate, duty, and personal loss, inviting quiet reflection rather than emotional uproar. Audiences observed, reacted gently, and absorbed social lessons embedded in the performance. Chariot races were structured spectacle. Teams, colors, and ritualized betting created anticipation. Fans cheered and groaned according to predictable patterns. Despite speed and competition, the rhythm of races, laps, pauses, and processions created steady, almost hypnotic engagement. Observation and mild emotional investment defined participation. Gladiatorial events were loud, formalized, and socially codified. Audiences knew the expected outcomes and rituals. Victories, defeats, and minor injuries followed familiar patterns. Spectators engaged patiently, understanding that the ceremony mattered more than raw excitement. Social learning, hierarchy, and endurance were embedded in ritual.
Smaller daily amusements balanced these larger spectacles. Board games, dice, and ball games offered gentle competition. Families and friends engaged slowly, repeated moves, and learned strategic patience. Children and adults alike participated in predictable patterns, quietly honing observation, reasoning, and endurance. Music punctuated daily life. Flutes, lyres, and percussion instruments accompanied meals, rituals, and leisure. Performances were repetitive, rhythmic, and soothing. Listeners absorbed sound, tempo, and subtle expression. Enjoyment was gentle, slow, and reflective. Public festivals combined spectacle with ritual. Processions, religious observances, and communal celebrations provided structure and rhythm to urban life. Attendance reinforced social cohesion, hierarchy, and subtle observation. Even excitement was measured, repetitive, and socially instructive. Amusement was never chaotic in Rome. Even laughter, surprise, or minor exhilaration followed expectation. Social norms guided behavior. Observation, patience, and quiet adaptation allowed citizens to participate without disruption. Life's rhythm was slow, continuous, and enduring. Through all of this, entertainment reinforced social cohesion, taught subtle lessons, and provided structured relief from daily labor. Participation was gentle, predictable, and cumulative. Over time, repeated engagement shaped social awareness, observation, and endurance. So as we float gently through Rome's theaters, arenas, and streets of daily amusement, let's notice how entertainment, slow, structured, and persistent, helped citizens navigate social life, maintain routine, and endure the rhythms of existence. Next, we'll continue exploring the subtler aspects of Roman civic life, public administration, law, and the quiet persistence of social order. All right,
Let's drift gently into another understated layer of Roman existence: civic life, law, and the quiet structures that maintained order across the city. Nothing dramatic, no courtroom drama, just the slow, deliberate rhythm of governance, observation, and adherence to custom that allowed society to endure. Rome was governed by combination of tradition, written law, and bureaucratic routine. Magistrates, senators, and local officials managed public life through predictable procedures. Citizens observed, complied, and learned the rhythms of civic participation quietly, day by day. Laws were codified in the 12 Tables and other legal texts, but interpretation required slow, careful observation. Officials applied rules with subtlety, balancing precedent, social status, and circumstance. Justice was methodical, deliberate, and procedural. Emotional displays were neither expected nor encouraged. Patience and attentiveness were central to understanding the system. Courts and tribunals operated on predictable schedules. Citizens attending trials observed formalities, seating, speech, and minor ritualized gestures. Arguments were presented slowly, often repetitively, and verdicts delivered with careful deliberation. Even conflict was framed within persistent, structured expectation. Administrative duties were pervasive. Tax collection, census-taking, maintenance of roads, aqueducts, and public spaces required methodical effort. Officials and clerks worked with quiet attention to detail. Errors were corrected gradually. Continuity and slow adaptation preserved functionality across the city. Neighborhoods also participated in civic life. Voting, attending assemblies, and observing public announcements reinforced collective awareness. Even minor acts of compliance or participation were repetitive and instructive. Endurance, observation, and adaptation were central to citizenship. Social order depended on subtle reinforcement. Hierarchy, reputation, and expectation guided behavior more than overt force. Observing customs, respecting authority, and participating in ritualized civic life maintained cohesion. Chaos was minimized not through spectacle, but through repetition, social pressure, and patient adherence to norms. Public projects, temples, aqueducts, roads, required communal engagement over long periods. Laborers, planners, and supervisors coordinated slowly, carefully, and continuously. Citizens observed construction, maintained expectations, and integrated outcomes into daily life. Infrastructure itself became a persistent rhythm of the city. Even minor disputes were resolved gradually. Mediation, negotiation, and small corrective actions reinforced social harmony. Patience and subtle social learning were more powerful than immediate punishment. Over time, these slow, deliberate processes maintained continuity, trust, and predictability. Religion and civic life overlapped. Rituals, festivals, and public ceremonies reminded citizens of hierarchy, obligation, and shared history. Participation was gentle, methodical, and cumulative. Life's flow was embedded in repetition, observation, and endurance. Through all of this, Rome functioned as a living organism of continuous, slow, and deliberate activity. Civic life, law, and administration were not dramatic spectacles. They were persistent, structured, and quietly essential. Citizens adapted to routines, learned patterns, and endured small frustrations with measured patience. So as we float through the persistent rhythms of Rome's governance, let's notice how the slow, cumulative, and methodical structures of civic life allowed one of history's most enduring cities to function for centuries. Next, we'll continue gently, exploring the quieter personal and domestic rituals that tied Roman citizens to family, neighborhood, and city over a lifetime. All right, let's drift gently into the final layers of everyday Roman existence, the personal rituals, daily habits, and persistent routines that quietly held life together. Nothing spectacular, no dramatic revelations, just the slow, continuous cadence of ordinary living that shaped endurance, identity, and social cohesion.
Everyday habits structured life from dawn to dusk. Waking early, washing, dressing, and preparing for work were repeated daily with minimal variation. Repetition created rhythm, continuity, and subtle predictability. Even small gestures, combing hair, arranging clothing, or checking supplies, reinforced calm observation and order. Meals, as previously noted, followed gentle patterns. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner were both sustenance and ritual. They reinforced hierarchy, family cohesion, and social learning. Eating slowly, observing others, and participating quietly embedded subtle norms and expectations into daily life. Household chores persisted continuously. Cleaning, cooking, laundry, and minor repairs occupied both free and structured time. These tasks required patience, attention, and adaptation. Even repetitive actions carried significance, maintaining order, ensuring comfort, and sustaining the household ecosystem. Persistence rather than speed or drama defined domestic competence. Personal grooming was deliberate and quiet. Hair, nails, skin, and clothing were attended to regularly, often using simple tools and natural products. Attention to these small details reinforced identity, status, and social readiness. Even minor lapses were noticed socially, so routine vigilance was a subtle yet consistent expectation. Exercise, leisure, and minor recreation were integrated gently into the day. Walking, stretching, light games, and social conversation balanced labor and routine. These activities provided continuity, reflection, and subtle physical conditioning. Life moved at a measured pace, allowing time for endurance and observation.
So, as we float through the quiet world of Roman superstition, we notice how small, repetitive beliefs structured decisions, reinforced social norms, and quietly maintained continuity in daily life. Next, let's drift into the understated rhythms of public health and sanitation. Nothing shocking, no plagues or medical drama, just the quiet, repetitive acts that allowed life to persist. Rome had aqueducts, public baths, sewers, and latrines. Maintenance required slow, methodical attention. Workers cleaned channels, repaired conduits, and ensured water flowed predictably. Citizens learned to adapt, observe hygiene practices, and participate in routine care. Endurance was necessary. Baths were daily rituals. Men and women visited public baths to cleanse, socialize, and reflect. Repetition created rhythm: warm water, cold plunge, massage, and conversation. Hygiene intertwined with leisure, social learning, and subtle observation. Life's cadence persisted, slowly but surely. Waste disposal was structured but imperfect. Public latrines and street sweepers reduced hazards gradually. Citizens learned patterns, adapted to odors and congestion, and maintained personal hygiene within constraints. Routine observation and minor precaution prevented serious disruption. Diet, labor, and personal habits reinforced health. Meals, exercise, and domestic routines were slow, cumulative, and structured. Even illness was managed gradually. Rest, herbal remedies, and observation shaped responses over days or weeks. Patience and persistence were central to survival. So, public health in Rome was less about dramatic intervention and more about quiet, persistent effort. Endurance, observation, and routine allowed a complex city to function for centuries with relative stability. Now let's drift into the gentle awareness of seasonal change. Life in Rome followed a slow, cyclical rhythm dictated by weather, festivals, and agricultural patterns. Nothing sudden, just the quiet flow of months, rituals, and labor. Spring brought planting, minor household cleaning, and small festivals. Citizens moved slowly, observing the emergence of crops and the calendar of observances. Labor, reflection, and cautious planning dominated attention. Patience and repetition shaped productivity. Summer introduced longer workdays, agricultural maintenance, and public festivals. Heat and rhythm influenced daily life. Leisure was punctuated by baths, walks, and calm social observation. Activities were predictable, repeated, and sustained over weeks. Autumn brought harvests, food preservation, and preparation for cooler months. Labor was deliberate, repetitive, and carefully managed. Meals reflected seasonal produce. Storage practices reinforced endurance and slow adaptation. Winter emphasized domestic routine, reflection, and quieter labor. Festivals and religious observances punctuated monotony. Citizens adapted to cold, scarcity, and limited activity. Patience, observation, and subtle social cohesion maintained life. Through all these seasons, life moved rhythmically, slowly, and persistently. Endurance, adaptation, and repetition defined existence more than drama or excitement. Finally, let's drift gently toward the slow conclusion of Roman life: death, mourning, and the understated rituals that concluded daily existence. Nothing dramatic, just the gentle, persistent flow of social, religious, and personal practices around mortality. Funerals were structured and repetitive. Families prepared bodies carefully, observing ritual, timing, and social norms. Processions were slow, orderly, and socially codified. Neighbors observed, participated, and reinforced subtle social cohesion. Life and death were integrated into the rhythm of the city. Tombs, memorials, and inscriptions provided continuity. Descendants and neighbors observed these markers, maintaining memory and subtle social instruction. Reflection, endurance, and gentle ritual persisted beyond individual life. Even mourning followed quiet rhythm. Rituals, small offerings, and repeated acts of remembrance embedded reflection into domestic and public life. Grief was observed, structured, and cumulative rather than explosive. Life concluded with measured endurance and quiet continuity. Through all of this, Rome's residents experienced a life defined by repetition, observation, and patient adaptation. From birth to death, the city moved slowly, persistently, and rhythmically, sustained by quiet routines, enduring habits, and subtle social structures. So, as we finally drift to a close, let's notice that the heartbeat of Rome was never dramatic or heroic. It was gentle, continuous, and enduring. Daily life, labor, ritual, and reflection combined to create a slow, persistent pulse that lasted centuries. Beyond soldiers and senators, Rome depended on quiet, unnoticed workers. These were people history rarely names, but the city could not survive without them. Lamplighters walked the streets at dusk, igniting oil lamps one by one. Street cleaners rose early, sweeping waste and debris before the city awakened. Water inspectors checked fountains daily, ensuring aqueducts flowed steadily. Public scribes wrote letters for those who couldn't read. They sat patiently in markets, listening carefully, translating thoughts into ink. Dock laborers unloaded ships slowly, methodically, day after day. These jobs required no glory, only consistency. Rome didn't run on ambition alone. It ran on repetition. Rome was loud, markets shouting, carts rattling, animals crying, and yet silence still existed. Temples offered quiet spaces where footsteps softened and voices lowered. Early mornings before sunrise were calm, when only bakers and guards moved through the streets. Inside homes, silence appeared in brief moments, during meals, prayer, or rest. Romans valued controlled speech. Too much talking was seen as careless. Even libraries and schools practiced quiet learning. Silence wasn't the absence of sound, it was intentional restraint, practiced slowly, daily. Life moved slowly. Entertainment wasn't constant. Many days were repetitive. Romans filled boredom with observation, sitting in forums, watching people pass, listening, not speaking, repeating small routines, cleaning tools, repairing sandals, organizing shelves. Storytelling helped pass time. Old men retold the same stories repeatedly. Children listened, already knowing the endings. Boredom wasn't avoided, it was accepted. Time passed not by excitement, but by patience. Roman children learned early, mostly through watching. They observed how adults greeted others, how disputes were settled, how patience was rewarded. Punishment was rare, correction was slow and firm. Children learned to wait, to speak only when necessary, to endure discomfort quietly. Toys were simple. Games taught balance, memory, and restraint. Childhood wasn't about freedom, it was about preparation. These lessons shaped adults who could endure long days, slow progress, and repetition without complaint. Rome didn't survive because of battles alone. It survived because people woke up every day and did the same things again: cleaning, working, repairing, observing, waiting. Systems were slow but stable. Traditions changed gradually. Knowledge passed quietly between generations. Rome wasn't built on constant innovation, but on consistency. That patience, more than power, is what kept the empire alive for centuries.
Sleep in ancient Rome was light, fragmented, and rarely peaceful. Most people slept on simple beds, wooden frames with rope supports, thin mattresses stuffed with straw or wool. Pillows were small, sometimes filled with feathers, sometimes with whatever was available. Romans did not sleep through the night. They woke naturally, often multiple times. Some prayed, some reflected, others simply lay awake, listening to the city breathe. Night was quiet, but never silent. Dogs barked, guards walked, water flowed through pipes. Sleep was not escape, it was pause. Romans believed dreams mattered. A strange dream could change plans. A repeated symbol caused worry. Professional dream interpreters existed and were taken seriously. Dreams weren't emotional confessions. They were messages, signs from gods, ancestors, or fate itself. People woke slowly, thinking carefully about what they saw in sleep, writing it down, sharing it quietly. Even nightmares weren't panic, they were warnings to be considered calmly. Romans experienced time differently. There were no minutes, only moments. Hours changed length depending on sunlight. Time expanded in summer and contracted in winter. Clocks were sundials and water clocks, imprecise, gentle, slow. Deadlines were flexible. Waiting was normal. Time passed by shadows moving, not by numbers ticking. Life followed daylight, not urgency. When darkness arrived, activity slowed.
No concerts, no scrolling, no constant stimulation. People stayed home, talked softly, ate simply, prepared for the next day. Night was for rest, thought, and quiet routine. Movement was limited, lamps were expensive. Stillness wasn't boredom, it was normal. As night deepened, Rome rested unevenly. The wealthy slept behind thick walls, the poor slept lightly, ready to wake. Guards kept watch, fires glowed softly. The city didn't shut down, it exhaled. Tomorrow would be the same, and that sameness was comforting. Rome endured because its people accepted repetition, silence, and slow passing time. Old age in Rome was not celebrated, it was tolerated. There were no retirements, no golden years. You worked as long as your body allowed, and then you slowed down without ceremony. Elderly Romans were respected in theory. In practice, respect depended on usefulness. If you still gave advice, managed property, or told good stories, you mattered. If not, you faded gently into the background. Wrinkles were not hidden. Gray hair was common. Aging was expected, quietly, without complaint. Old people sat in doorways. They watched the street. They remembered things no one asked about anymore. Time moved slower for them, and that was fine. Being sick in Rome was ordinary. Most people were sick often. Coughs, fevers, aches, infections that never fully healed. Doctors existed, but treatment was inconsistent. Remedies involved herbs, rest, superstition, and patience. Lots of patience. Pain was endured, not dramatized. Complaining was seen as weakness. You worked through discomfort unless you physically couldn't. People expected the body to fail slowly, and when it did, life adjusted around it. Death in Rome was familiar. Children died often, adults died suddenly. Accidents, disease, exhaustion. No one was shocked by death. Sad, yes, but not surprised. Bodies were prepared simply. Funerals were brief. Mourning followed rules. Crying had limits. Life did not stop. Shops reopened. Streets stayed busy. Death was not an interruption. It was part of the schedule. Romans buried their dead outside the city. Gravestones lined roads so travelers would see names as they passed. Memory was public, but temporary. Most graves were modest, a name, and age, sometimes a short line of text. People visited occasionally, then less often, then not at all. For most Romans, being remembered for a few generations was enough. Eternity was not expected. Romans accepted endings the way they accepted beginnings, without much emotion. Buildings crumbled, families ended, traditions faded. Nothing was permanent, and that was understood. Life wasn't about legacy, it was about endurance. Wake up, do your part, rest, repeat. And when it ended quietly. Rome didn't collapse suddenly. It got tired. Roads still existed, laws still worked, people still showed up to work, but everything felt heavier than before. Repairs took longer, decisions were delayed. Promises were made carefully, or not at all. Taxes increased slowly, then quietly. Soldiers waited longer for pay. Officials reused old ideas because new ones required energy no one had. No one announced decline, they just felt it. Most Romans never lived in Rome's best years. They heard stories of stronger emperors, fuller markets, better times. But stories were all they had. For them, Rome had always been crowded, expensive, and demanding. Life had always been work, waiting, and endurance. The idea of decline didn't matter much. This was normal life.
Ambition softened. People aimed lower, not out of fear, but realism. Fewer risks, more caution. Families focused inward. Communities became smaller. Trust narrowed to neighbors, not the state. Rome wasn't abandoned, it was downsized emotionally. Hope became quieter. For many citizens, the empire stopped feeling real. Rome was a word, a concept, a distant authority. Local life mattered more than imperial news. What happened down the street mattered more than what happened at the border. Power existed, but it felt abstract. People adapted. They always did. Rome didn't end one day. There was no moment where everyone stopped and said, "Well, that's it." Life continued, just differently, slower, smaller, quieter. Buildings decayed gently. Titles lost meaning. Traditions faded without argument. Rome didn't fall asleep suddenly. It drifted. Just like we've been drifting through history tonight. Dim the lights, slow your breathing, and let Rome finally rest. After Rome faded, life didn't restart. People still woke up early, still worked fields, still argued over prices and boundaries, still worried about weather and health and tomorrow. What changed was scale. Big systems became small ones, grand titles became local authority, written law became memory and habit. Rome didn't vanish, it thinned out, and most people barely noticed the difference day to day. Romans were used to adapting. They had adapted to floods, fires, bad emperors, shortages, and endless rules. So adapting again was nothing new. When roads weren't repaired, people found paths. When coins lost value, people traded goods. When officials disappeared, neighbors stepped in. No speeches, no resistance, just adjustment. Even after Rome was gone, it lingered, in stone ruins, in reused buildings, in habits passed down without explanation. People lived among broken columns and old roads, not thinking much about them. Rome became background scenery, familiar, silent, unquestioned. Crowded cities, rising costs, overworked people, big systems slowly losing efficiency. None of this feels ancient. Rome wasn't special because it was powerful. It was special because it was human. And humans haven't changed much. So when we look back at ancient Rome, not the statues, not the battles, not the emperors, what we really see is routine. People waking up tired, doing what needed doing, waiting, enduring, resting, and doing it again tomorrow. Which, honestly, doesn't feel that far away. Thanks for drifting through history tonight. Dim the lights, slow your breathing, and let Rome finally rest.